The summer of 1873 settled over the grasslands near Broken Arrow like a smothering blanket. Dust hung perpetually in the air, turning sunsets into bloody spectacles and coating every surface with a fine gray powder that got into food clothes and lungs. The town itself sat at the edge of the great empty collection of weather-beaten buildings along a single rutted street that turned to mud when it rained and baked hard as iron when it didn't. Grace Moretti stood at the window of her cabin, watching 8 riders materialize out of the heat shimmer like demons conjured from the earth itself. She was 27 years old, though the 3 years since Samuel's death had etched lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her hands resting on the windowsill were calloused from work hands that had hauled water-chopped wood-mended fences and buried a husband. She had known they would come eventually. Men like Solomon Price did not make threats idly, and she had seen too much, heard too much in that alley behind the telegraph office 2 days ago. The riders circled the cabin with practiced efficiency, cutting off escape routes. Grace recognized Fergus Kane immediately, the tall man in the duster coat, his face a map of violence, a silver bounty hunter's badge glinting on his vest. Behind him rode Clubfoot Charlie Jackrabbit Jim and 5 others whose names she didn't know, but whose intentions were clear. She reached for Samuel's Winchester leaning against the wall where she'd kept it since that overheard conversation. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun, streaming through the window. Her heart hammered, but her hands were steady. 3 years of solitude had taught her that fear was just another companion. Like loneliness, you learned to live with it, or you didn't survive. The first shot came without warning, punching through the thin wall and shattering a plate on the shelf. Grace dropped to the floor, crawling toward the table for better cover. More shots followed, a thunderous barrage that turned the cabin into a trap of flying splinters and broken glass. She returned fire through the window, aiming low, as her father had taught her years ago in Pennsylvania before she'd ever dreamed of the West. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder, the sound deafening in the small space. She saw a man, Clubfoot Charlie, tumble from his horse, clutching his thigh. Then the door exploded inward. Grace swung the rifle like a club, catching the first man across the jaw. Bone cracked. He went down. But the second man was faster, bringing his revolver down on the side of her head with brutal efficiency. Pain burst white behind her eyes, and the floor rushed up to meet her. She hit the ground outside the impact, driving the air from her lungs. Through a gray fog, she was dimly aware of Fergus Kane's boots stepping over her, heard his voice giving orders to search the cabin, find the ledger. Then another sound cut through the chaos, a single rifle shot that shattered the lantern on the porch, plunging everything into premature darkness. Grace tried to focus, tried to understand what was happening. Through blurred vision, she saw Fergus and his men gather near the door, staring at something. Their voices carried in the sudden stillness, tense and uncertain. "That's Neshoba's mark." Jackrabbit Jim said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "That red hand. Every man in 3 territories knows what it means." Grace turned her head, ignoring the spike of pain, and saw it. On the cabin door at chest height, a handprint stood out stark and vivid against the weathered gray wood. The paint was the deep red of dried blood, each finger clearly defined, the palm broad and unmistakable. Neshoba. Even through her pain and fear, Grace felt something shift inside her. She had not asked for his protection, had not known he'd placed this mark. But seeing it now, seeing these hard men hesitate before it, she understood that she was not as alone as she'd believed. "If we kill her under that mark," Clubfoot Charlie said, struggling to his feet with Jim's help, "Apache will say we declared war. Railroad won't pay us if their trains can't run safe." Fergus Kane stood frozen, his revolver half raised, caught between Solomon's money and his own survival instinct. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass and Grace's ragged breathing. Then Fergus holstered his gun with a violent motion. Mount up. We'll finish this another way. But that Apache dies, and so does she. I don't care what mark he's painted. They rode off, leaving Grace bleeding in the dust, leaving the crimson handprint glowing like a promise in the fading light. High on the ridge, Neshoba lowered his rifle and began moving down the slope toward the cabin, toward the woman whose refusal to betray him had now sealed both their fates. Grace woke to gentle hands, cleaning the blood from her face. She flinched, gasped, and tried to sit up, but those same hands pressed her shoulders down. "Be still," a voice said. Male quiet with the careful precision of someone speaking a language learned rather than inherited. "You are safe now." She focused with difficulty. Neshoba knelt beside her in the cabin, a wet cloth in his hand, his dark eyes studying her with professional detachment. He'd carried her inside, she realized, and was now treating her wounds with supplies from her own shelf-carbolic clean linen thread. "The ledger," she managed her voice rough. "Did they find it?" "No, I have it." He gestured to the metal box on the table still sealed. Why does Solomon Price want this so badly? He would hire Fergus Kane. Grace sat up slowly, the room spinning briefly before settling. "Because it proves he's been killing people to get their land. My husband, others, all for the railroad." Neshoba was silent for a moment, his jaw tightening. Then he said, "Tell me everything." So she did. She told him about overhearing Solomon and Fergus in the alley, about the ledgers Samuel had hidden about the contract that had cost her husband his life. Neshoba listened without interrupting, occasionally checking her pupils for signs of concussion, his movements economical and practiced. When she finished, he opened the ledger and read slowly, his finger tracing the entries. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the strong bones, the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived hard. "This marks me too," he said finally. "Solomon has been blaming Apache for attacks we never made. Here." He pointed to an entry. "This wagon burned last spring. Solomon claimed Apache raiders, but my people were 50 miles north at the reservation trading for winter supplies. I have the trading post receipts." Grace looked at him, understanding crystallizing. "He's been using your people as an excuse." "Yes, and when the railroad comes, they will push us off the last good water." His voice was controlled, but beneath it ran a current of anger so deep it had calcified into something harder than rage. "The army promised us land along this creek. Permanent rights, they said. But promises die easy when money is involved." He pulled papers from a leather pouch, at his belt notes, sketches, dates. "I kept these from when I scouted for the railroad survey. I did not trust Solomon even then. He marked sites of accidents weeks before they happened." Grace stared at the evidence spread before them. "We have to get this to the marshal, the territorial marshal in Silver City. Silver City is 200 miles away. Solomon will have men watching the roads." "Then we use the telegraph," Grace said, leaning forward despite the pain in her head. "We send the evidence by wire. It can't be intercepted if we send it directly to the marshal's office." Neshoba considered this, then nodded slowly. "We will need help? Dr. Vogel, perhaps, and the school teacher." "Dorothea," Grace said. "She's been teaching Apache children. Quietly, but Solomon knows. He's already threatened to have her dismissed." "Then she has reason to help us." Neshoba stood, moving to the window to check the darkness outside. "But first, you need to understand something. That mark on your door, it is not just paint. It is a promise I made. In my language, we call it Elio, the red hand of protection. I placed it there after you defended me against those cowboys last spring." Grace rose unsteadily to her feet. "I didn't know you'd done that." "You were not meant to know. It was enough that others did. He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she saw his expression clearly for the first time. Not the stoic mask she'd expected, but something more complex, more human. But now I have drawn you into a fight that was already mine. Solomon will not stop, neither will Fergus. Samuel tried to stop, Grace said quietly. He tried to back out of the deal to warn others. They killed him for it. So this fight was mine before it was yours. They stood in the small cabin, two people bound by circumstance and survival. And Grace felt something shift between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. They were both alone, both betrayed, both standing against forces that would erase them without a second thought. We should leave, Neshoba said. They will return. Solomon will make sure of it. Where? There is an old mine in Red Canyon, abandoned but defensible. We can hide there, make our plan. Grace looked around the cabin at the home she and Samuel had built at 3 years of solitude and grief embedded in every board. Then she thought of Samuel lying in the rocky ground behind the house of the dreams they'd buried with him. All right, she said. Let's go. They gathered what they could carry, the ledger, ammunition, food, blankets. Neshoba moved with quiet efficiency, teaching her by example how to pack for survival rather than comfort. As they prepared to leave, Grace paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. The crimson handprint on the outer door seemed to glow in the darkness, a promise made flesh. Someone will stand and speak, she thought. Someone will not be erased. Then she followed Neshoba into the night, leaving the cabin to whatever dawn would bring. Red Canyon earned its name from the rust-colored rock that formed its walls, striated layers of ancient sediment that glowed blood red in the setting sun. The abandoned silver mine sat halfway up the north face, its entrance a black mouth surrounded by the detritus of human ambition. Rusted ore carts, broken timbers, crates of supplies left behind when the vein ran out and the miners moved on. Grace and Neshoba arrived near midnight, having walked the final miles to avoid leaving a trail. The climb was steep, the path more memory than substance. Twice Grace stumbled, and twice Neshoba caught her, his hand firm on her elbow, his body positioned to block any fall. Inside the mine was cool and damp, the air heavy with the smell of stone and old water. Neshoba lit a small fire near the entrance, positioned so the smoke would dissipate before reaching the outside, then checked the deeper tunnels to ensure they were alone. Grace sank down beside the fire, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her head throbbed where Fergus had struck her, and her shoulder ached from the Winchester's recoil. She watched Neshoba move through the shadows, noting the slight hitch in his stride. He was injured too. She realized, though, he'd said nothing. When he returned, she pointed to the dark stain on his side. Let me see that. He hesitated, then removed his shirt with careful movements. The bullet had grazed his ribs, a long, shallow furrow that had bled freely but wasn't deep enough to be mortal. Still, it needed cleaning. Grace moved closer, bringing the water and cloth they'd packed. As she cleaned the wound, she became acutely aware of the intimacy of the situation and the firelight casting shadows on his skin, the smell of sweat and blood and sage, the way he controlled his breathing when the carbolic stung. "You've been shot before," she said. It wasn't a question. Many times. His voice was low, almost meditative. The army used us as scouts because we could go places soldiers could not. But we took the same bullets. Why did you leave the army? Neshoba was quiet for a long moment. Then, in the same measured tone, he said, "In 1871, they promised my people land along the Gila River. Good land with water. In exchange, we would guide their patrols, help them find other Apache who still fought. My father was a chief. He believed the promises. He signed the treaty himself. Grace tied off the bandage, her hands gentle despite their roughness. She waited. 6 months later, they moved us to San Carlos. A dry place, no game, bad water. My father tried to speak to the agent to show him the treaty. The agent laughed. Neshoba's voice remained level, but Grace heard the frozen rage beneath. My father died that winter. Fever. But it was really despair that killed him. My mother followed him a month later. She simply stopped eating. "I'm sorry," Grace said, knowing the words were inadequate. Sorry does not bring them back. Sorry does not honor treaties. He looked at her directly. That is when I learned that a white man's written word means nothing unless it benefits him. Only actions matter. Only what you do when no one is watching. Grace sat back, understanding why her defense of him last spring had meant so much. She had acted when action carried a cost, had refused to betray him when betrayal would have been easier. Samuel died because he tried to do the right thing too late, she heard herself saying. He signed those papers with Solomon, took the money. He thought we could build something here, that the railroad would bring prosperity. But then he saw what Solomon was really doing, the threats, the accidents that weren't accidents. He tried to back out, tried to warn others. She stopped, surprised by the tears on her face. She hadn't cried since the funeral, hadn't allowed herself to feel anything but the grinding necessity of survival. They shot him on the road to town. She continued, her voice breaking. Made it look like robbery. But I found the papers later, found the ledger. I knew. I've known for 2 years, and I did nothing because I was afraid and alone and didn't know who to trust. Neshoba reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her shoulder. Just that a hand on her shoulder, warm and solid and real. You are not alone now, he said simply. They sat in the firelight, two damaged people who had found in each other not salvation, but something perhaps more valuable, honest company in a world of liars. The railroad will come regardless of what we do, Neshoba said after a while. That is 1873. But perhaps we can make them pay for the ground they take. Make them account for the lives they've destroyed. That's all I want, Grace said. Justice. For Samuel, for your parents, for everyone Solomon has crushed under his schemes. Then we will get it, Neshoba said, and Grace believed him. Later, as the fire died to embers, and Grace drifted toward sleep, wrapped in a blanket, she heard Neshoba moving near the mine entrance, keeping watch. She thought about the crimson handprint on her door, about the Apache tradition it represented, Elio, the red hand of protection. She had been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be valued enough, that someone would stand between her and harm. It wasn't love that would be too simple too fast, but it was something, a foundation on which other things might someday be built. If they survived. Zachary Harlan, called Big Sky, since he'd been 12 years old and already 6 feet tall, stood in Solomon Price's rented room above the saloon and tried to remember when he'd stopped being a lawman and become a paid accomplice. The answer, he knew, was gradual. $1 here to look the other way when surveyors cut a fence. $5 there to delay investigating a suspicious fire. $50 his monthly salary to make sure Grace Moretti understood she was not safe in her isolated cabin. The money sat in his room in a tobacco tin, and it felt heavier every day. I need you to bring them in, Solomon was saying, pacing the narrow room with nervous energy. He was a thin man, all angles and calculation, dressed in his eternal black suit. The widow and the Apache. Dead or alive, I genuinely don't care which. Big Sky looked at the warrant Solomon had thrust into his hands. The paper was too clean, the seal too perfect. This came from Judge Carver. He's 200 miles away in Silver City. How'd you get it so fast? I paid for it in advance. Solomon said, no shame in his voice. I knew I'd need warrants eventually, so I bought several. Efficient, don't you think? Big Sky stared at the blank lines, now filled in with Grace's and Neshoba's names. Paid for in advance. Bought and ready to destroy whomever Solomon pointed at. You're asking me to arrest people for crimes you invented. Big Sky said slowly. I'm asking you to do your job. Solomon's voice hardened. Or shall I write to the territorial governor about your supplemental income? I kept very good records, Deputy. Very good. The threat hung between them clear and sharp. Big Sky could imagine the letter, the investigation, the disgrace. He'd be finished as a lawman, possibly prosecuted himself. But something else hung in the air too, and the memory of a small Apache girl approaching him outside the schoolhouse 3 days ago. Mr. Sky, she'd said in careful English, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. Why is my uncle wanted for helping people? Teacher said he pulled Dr. Vogel's boy from the river. Why is that bad? Big Sky had mumbled something and walked away, but the question had burrowed into him like a tick. Why was that bad? Why was Neshoba, who'd never harmed anyone, who lived quietly and bothered no one, suddenly a wanted murderer because Solomon Price said so? Because the railroad wanted Grace's land and Neshoba's creek? Because money moved in straight lines and crushed anything in its path? I'll think about it, Big Sky heard himself say. Solomon's eyes narrowed. Don't think too long, Deputy. Fergus Kane is already hunting them. I'd hate for him to reach them first and deprive you of the arrest fee. $200 is $200 after all. After Big Sky left, he walked the evening streets of Broken Arrow, really seeing the town for the first time in months. It wasn't much, 20 buildings, maybe 300 people, half of them transient workers or drifters. But it was his town, his responsibility. He passed the schoolhouse and saw Dorothea Lane through the window, cleaning slates by lamplight. She glanced up, saw him, and her expression shifted, not hostility exactly, but disappointment. She knew. Somehow she knew what he'd become. At the general store, Dr. Vogel was loading supplies into his wagon. The German doctor nodded politely, but didn't smile. He knew too. Big Sky returned to his small office behind the livery and sat at his desk, the warrant lying before him like an accusation. In the corner sat the tobacco tin with Solomon's money blood. Money, he realized now. $50 a month to compromise everything he'd sworn to uphold. He thought about his father, who'd been a cavalry officer who'd taught Zachary that a man's word was his bond, that the law existed to protect the weak from the strong. What would the old man think of him now? Big Sky opened the tobacco tin, counted the money, $250, 5 months of shame, and felt something hard crystallize in his chest. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Couldn't give back the days he'd looked away while Solomon's men intimidated settlers. But he could stop. He could choose right now to be the man his father had tried to raise. It might cost him everything. Probably would. But at least he'd be able to look at his reflection without flinching. Big Sky stood pinned on his badge, checked the load in his Colt Peacemaker, and walked out into the night. He wasn't sure yet where he was going or what he'd do when he got there. But he knew he was done working for Solomon Price. Dr. Albert Vogel kept a key to the telegraph office. As the town's only doctor, he sometimes needed to send urgent wires for medical supplies or to summon specialists. The clerk had given him a spare key years ago, trusting that a man who saved lives wouldn't abuse the privilege. Now standing in his cramped office while Grace and Neshoba laid out their plan, Albert held that key and felt the weight of the decision before him. "You're asking me to commit a crime," he said in his thick German accent. "We're asking you to help us prevent more. Grace replied. Solomon has killed at least 6 people that we can prove. How many more will die if the railroad comes through, and he has all that power behind him? Albert looked at Neshoba, who stood quietly by the window, watching the street below. You saved my Ernst. Pulled him from the creek when he fell in. I never thanked you properly. No thanks were needed, Neshoba said. But they are owed. Albert made his decision, pulled the key from his pocket. The clerk goes home at 8 o'clock. The office is empty until morning. You will have perhaps 20 minutes before someone notices the wire traffic. That's all we need, Grace said. They planned it carefully. Dorothea Lane would create a distraction on the street, something to draw attention away from the telegraph office. Big Sky. Well, they weren't sure about Big Sky. He was the unknown variable, possibly the most dangerous piece on the board. I think he's changing, Grace said. The way he looked at Fergus when they came to the cabin, like he was seeing something he didn't like. We cannot rely on that, Neshoba said. Hope is not a plan. But sometimes hope was all you had. They approached the town after dark, moving separately to avoid attention. Grace went in first, dressed in clothes borrowed from Dorothea, a simple dress and bonnet that made her look like any settler wife. She slipped into the alley behind the telegraph office and waited, her heart hammering. Neshoba circled through the outskirts, using the skills he'd learned as a scout to move through shadows. He positioned himself on a rooftop across the street, rifle ready, watching for trouble. At precisely 8:15, Dorothea Lane walked into the street with a schoolbook in her hands and began reading aloud a dramatic passage from Shakespeare, her voice carrying in the evening air. People stopped to listen, amused by the eccentric schoolteacher's performance. Grace tried the back door. Locked. She used Albert's key, her hands shaking, and the lock clicked open. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. The telegraph office was small, cramped, dominated by the key and its clicking mechanisms. Grace had never sent a wire before, but Samuel had shown her how the Morse code worked, had taught her to recognize the patterns. She sat down, pulled out the notes she'd carefully prepared, and began to tap out the message. To Marshall Jennings, Silver City, stop urgent evidence of murder, stop railroad agent Solomon Price, Broken Arrow, stop. She was halfway through the message when the door burst open and Deputy Big Sky Harlan stepped inside, his hand on his gun. Grace froze, the key silent beneath her fingers. Don't stop, Big Sky said quietly. Finish it. Grace stared at him, not understanding. Finish the message, Mrs. Moretti, Big Sky repeated. I'll watch the door. You're helping us? I'm done helping Solomon. He moved to the window, peering out. But you need to hurry. Fergus and his men are in town, and they're drinking heavy. When they realize what you're doing, this office becomes a killing box. Grace's fingers flew over the key, tapping out the evidence from the ledger dates, named sums. Each click was a small victory, a piece of truth sent flying along the copper wire toward justice. She was on the final paragraph when shots rang out in the street. Big Sky swore, drew his peacemaker. They figured it out. Fergus is coming. 30 more seconds. Grace said, her fingers cramping but refusing to stop. Outside, Dorothea's voice had stopped. Now there were shouts, the crash of breaking glass. Neshoba's rifle cracked once, twice, warning shots driving men into cover. Big Sky shoved the desk against the door just as boots pounded up the steps. Send it now. Grace tapped the final line. Ledger in possession of bearer Stop Moretti, and slammed the transmission key. The door exploded inward and the desk sliding back. Fergus Kane stood in the doorway, his wounded hand wrapped in dirty cloth, his face twisted with rage. Behind him pressed 3 of his men, all armed. You've made your last mistake, widow, Fergus snarled. Big Sky fired the shot, deafening in the small space. Fergus's gun hand, his good hand this time, jerked back, blood spraying. The gun clattered to the floor. "She's under the law's protection now," Big Sky said coldly. "And so is Neshoba. You want to press this, you'll do it through me." For a moment, the world balanced on a knife edge. Then Fergus's men backed down, dragging their boss with them, leaving a trail of blood on the wooden steps. Grace stood on shaking legs, the transmitted message complete. She looked at Big Sky, really looked at him, and saw not the compromised deputy she'd feared, but a man who'd chosen his moment and his side. "Thank you," she said. Big Sky holstered his gun. "Don't thank me yet. Solomon will come with everything he has, and the marshal is 2 days away at best. Then we need to get ready," Neshoba said from the doorway, his rifle still smoking. They slipped out into the night, leaving the telegraph office to its clicking silence, the message already racing toward Silver City, and the hope of justice. Behind them in the saloon, Solomon Price received word of what had happened and began planning his final move. If the law was coming, he'd make sure there was nothing left for them to find, no cabin, no witnesses, no evidence. Just ashes and convenient lies. They had perhaps 12 hours before Solomon organized his response. Grace, Neshoba, Big Sky, Dr. Vogel, and Dorothea Lane used every minute. The cabin was indefensible as it stood, thin walls, limited sight lines, only one door. But with preparation, it could become a fortress of sorts, or at least enough of one to survive until the marshal arrived. Neshoba directed the work with calm authority, his military training evident in every decision. They reinforced the windows with spare boards, created firing positions behind stacked grain sacks, dug shallow rifle pits in the yard. Dr. Vogel brought medical supplies and set up a makeshift surgery inside. Dorothea, her hands shaking, but her face determined, helped Grace inventory ammunition and prepare water for what would surely be a desperate fight. Big Sky rode back to town, once returning with extra rifles and a box of cartridges he'd requisitioned from the general store. "Solomon's gathered 15 men," he reported. "Every hard case and drunk between here and Silver City. They're coming at dawn." Neshoba studied the terrain as the sun set his sharp eyes, cataloging every rock, every dip in the ground, every potential approach. "They'll try to overrun us quickly," he said. "Solomon can't afford a long fight at too much chance of witnesses, too much time for the marshal to arrive." "Can we hold?" Grace asked. Neshoba turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his expression was unreadable. "We can try." That night, as they waited for dawn, and the violence it would bring, Grace found herself sitting on the porch steps beside Neshoba. The others were inside resting while they could. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama below. "I've been thinking," Grace said quietly, "about what happens after, if we survive." "After is a long way away," Neshoba replied. "But if the marshal comes, if Solomon is arrested, if this all somehow works out." She paused, searching for words. "What will you do?" Neshoba was silent for a long time. Then he said, "My people have a saying. Shiloba nayo. It means the future is uncertain. We plan for seasons, not years. We adapt to what comes." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." He looked at her, then his dark eyes reflecting starlight. 3 days ago I lived alone. I expected to die alone, probably at the end of a rope or a bullet. Now," he trailed off. "Now," Grace prompted. "Now I have a reason to see tomorrow," he said simply. Before Grace could respond, a distant sound reached them, hoofbeats, many horses approaching from the east. They both stood hands, moving to weapons. But it was Lucian Barra, the French shepherd riding hard with his sheepdog running alongside. He pulled up in the yard, his weathered face anxious in the moonlight. "They are coming," he gasped in his thick accent. 15, maybe more. I saw them gathering. They have torches. Monsieur Price, he told them to burn everything, leave nothing. "How long?" Big Sky called from the doorway. "An hour, maybe less." They had run out of time. Dawn broke red and violent over Broken Arrow. They came as Nashoba predicted, 15 riders in a loose skirmish line, rifles ready, torches burning in the half-light. Solomon Price hung back on a rise to the east, watching through brass field glasses, directing the assault like a general far from the blood. The first shots came at 100 yards, probing fire meant to test the defenses. Nashoba held his return fire, letting them come closer, making every bullet count. Beside him, Grace crouched behind grain sacks, the Winchester heavy in her hands, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Wait," Nashoba said calmly. "Wait." At 50 yards, he fired. The lead rider's horse went down, throwing its rider hard. The line faltered. "Now," Nashoba said, and they all opened fire. The roar was deafening. Grace squeezed the trigger, felt the kick worked, the lever fired again. The Winchester grew hot in her hands. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. Through the haze, she saw men falling, horses rearing the attack, dissolving into chaos. But they came again, and again. Club foot. Charlie, his wounded leg, barely healed, charged the porch on foot, firing wildly. Big Sky shot him in the chest, and he went down, hard blood spreading across the dusty boards. Jackrabbit Jim threw a torch onto the roof. Dorothea, her dress hiked up, and her face streaked with soot, climbed up with a bucket of water and doused the flames before they could spread. A bullet took Big Sky in the shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. Dr. Vogel dragged him inside, already calling for supplies, his practiced hands moving with surgical precision even as bullets punched through the walls around him. Grace's Winchester ran dry. She grabbed Samuel's old Colt revolver from her belt, the one she'd carried since his death, and kept firing. A man appeared at the window. She shot him in the face at point-blank range, and he fell back screaming. Through it all, Nashoba fired with mechanical precision, his face calm despite the blood soaking his side from a grazing wound. He'd been hit twice more, but showed no sign of slowing. Grace understood then that this was a man who'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every fight, every betrayal, every loss had been building to this desperate stand. An hour into the fight, the attack faltered. 5 of Solomon's men were dead, 7 more wounded. The survivors pulled back, regrouping beyond rifle range. In the cabin, Grace reloaded with shaking hands. Her shoulder was one massive bruise from the Winchester's recoil. Her ears rang so badly she could barely hear. Dr. Vogel worked on Big Sky's shoulder, extracting the bullet, while the deputy gritted his teeth and refused to cry out. "They'll come again," Nashoba said, checking his remaining ammunition. "And we're almost out of cartridges." "Then we need a different strategy," Grace said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, distant and cold. "The mine. The dynamite." Nashoba looked at her sharply. "That's a mile away up a cliff face, and they'll see anyone who tries to reach it." "Not if we go during the next attack," Grace said. "Not if we go together. It's suicide. So is staying here." Grace met his eyes. "You know I'm right." Nashoba studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We go when they charge again. Fast and low, use the creek bed for cover." The second assault came an hour later, heralded by gunfire so intense it seemed impossible that anyone inside the cabin could survive. Under cover of that storm of lead, Grace and Nashoba slipped out the back, crawling through the tall grass toward the creek. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from Grace's head. Another tore through Neshoba's vest so close she felt the wind of its passage. But they made it to the creek bed, used the shallow depression to put ground between themselves and the fight. The climb to the mine was brutal. Grace's hands bled from gripping sharp rock. Her lungs burned. Beside her, Neshoba moved with dogged determination, despite his wounds, never complaining, never hesitating. They reached the mine entrance just as the sun climbed to noon, the heat already oppressive. Inside the dynamite crates sat undisturbed the sticks sweating nitroglycerin after years in the damp cool. "We need to be careful," Neshoba said, handling the explosives with extreme care. "This old, it's unstable. Could blow if we move it wrong." They selected 6 sticks, the best preserved, and coiled a length of blasting fuse. Neshoba calculated the burn time, 30 seconds per foot, and cut enough for a 2-minute delay. "Where?" Grace asked. Neshoba led her to the ledge above where Solomon's men had positioned themselves. Below, she could see them clearly, 10 men left now, gathering for what they clearly intended to be the final assault. They planted the dynamite in a natural crevice, wedging it tight against the rock face. The fuse was old, but seemed serviceable. Neshoba made the final connections with hands that were rock steady despite the blood still seeping from his wounds. "When I light this," he said, "we run. No hesitation. The collapse will be massive." "I understand." He looked at her, then really looked at her. And Grace saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected: fear. Not for himself, but for her. "If this goes wrong," he began. "It won't," she said firmly. "But if it does, I want you to know that these past days fighting beside you, it's been—" He stopped, struggled for words. "It's been an honor." "Don't," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Don't say goodbye yet." Neshoba lit the fuse. It caught with a hiss and spark, the flame beginning its steady crawl toward the explosives. "Run," he said. They ran. Behind them the fuse burned. Below, oblivious, Solomon's men prepared their final assault. The world held its breath. Then the dynamite exploded. The blast was not a single boom, but a rolling thunder that seemed to crack the world open. The cliff face above Solomon's men simply came apart, tons of rock and earth, transforming into an avalanche of crushing death. Grace and Neshoba threw themselves behind a boulder as the shockwave hit a wall of sound and pressure that squeezed the air from their lungs. Dust filled the world so thick, Grace couldn't see her hand before her face. When it cleared, the scene below was one of devastation. The rock slide had caught 6 men, burying them instantly. The others were scattered, their horses gone, their weapons lost in the chaos. Through the settling dust, Grace saw Solomon Price on his distant rise, standing frozen, his field glasses still raised to his eyes. But there was something else. Movement at the mine entrance behind them. "Neshoba!" Grace screamed. Fergus Kane, his face a mask of blood and rage, emerged from the tunnel they'd just fled. He must have circled around during the chaos, intent on finishing them while they were exposed. His guns were gone, lost in the explosion, but he held a length of timber like a club. Neshoba turned, still dizzy from the blast, and saw Fergus charging. He brought his rifle up, but the mechanism jammed, damaged by the shockwave or clogged with dust, it didn't matter. Fergus was 3 steps away, the timber raised to kill. A smaller figure darted from behind a boulder, the boy from Dorothea's school, the Apache child, who'd asked Big Sky about her uncle. She'd followed them, somehow drawn by childish curiosity or hero worship or simple bad luck. Now she stood directly in Fergus's path, frozen with terror. Neshoba didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbed the child, and threw her back toward Grace. The timber meant for the girl caught him instead, a crushing blow to his chest that drove him to his knees. Grace fired Samuel's Colt, the shot wild, but it made Fergus stagger back. Behind them, the mine entrance groaned, and the explosion had destabilized the entire structure. Cracks spiderwebbed across the rock face. Support beams snapped with sounds like rifle shots. "The mine's collapsing," Grace shouted. Fergus, mad with rage and pain and the knowledge that he'd lost everything, charged again. But the ground beneath him shifted, and suddenly he was sliding, scrambling, unable to gain purchase. The mine entrance collapsed inward with a roar, and Fergus Kane vanished into the earth, his scream cutting off abruptly as tons of rock sealed the tomb. Grace grabbed Neshoba, pulled him away from the disintegrating cliff face. The Apache girl clung to them both, sobbing. They half ran, half fell down the slope, chunks of rock still falling around them, until they reached level ground and collapsed in a heap. For a long moment, Grace just lay there, breathing alive, against all probability. Beside her, Neshoba coughed, spat blood, but managed to sit up. His chest would be a mass of bruises, possibly broken ribs, but he was alive. The girl threw her arms around his neck, babbling thanks in a mixture of Apache and English. Neshoba gently patted her back, his dark eyes finding Grace's over the child's shoulder. "Is it over?" Grace asked. Before Neshoba could answer, a gunshot cracked across the prairie. They turned to see the cabin in the distance, where Big Sky had emerged onto the porch, his wounded shoulder bound as peacemaker, aimed at Solomon Price. "Over," Neshoba confirmed. But not finished. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later with 4 deputies and a warrant for Solomon Price's arrest. By then, the story had spread across 3 territories: the widow, the Apache scout, and the deputy, who changed sides. Already it was becoming a legend, the facts blurring into myth. But in the Silver City courthouse 3 weeks later, there was nothing mythical about the evidence. Grace sat in the witness stand, the ledger open before her, and methodically destroyed Solomon Price's defense. She read entries in her clear, steady voice, dates, payments, coded references to clearing obstacles that everyone in the courtroom understood meant murder. Dr. Vogel testified about the suspicious wounds he'd treated, injuries that matched deliberate violence rather than accidents. Dorothy Elaine described Solomon's threats against anyone who helped Apache families. Lucian Barr, with halting English but fierce conviction, told of surveyors who'd threatened to burn his sheep alive if he didn't sell. But it was Big Sky's testimony that sealed Solomon's fate. The deputy took the stand with visible reluctance, a man about to confess his own crimes to ensure justice for others. He detailed the bribes he'd accepted, the warnings he'd ignored, the times he'd looked away, while Solomon's men did their brutal work. "I was bought," Big Sky said, his voice rough. "Not all at once, but piece by piece, until I didn't recognize myself anymore. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking that my testimony be weighed against my guilt, so that Solomon Price answers for what he's done." Solomon's lawyer, a slick Denver attorney paid for with railroad money, tried to paint Grace as an unreliable, hysteric Neshoba, as a savage Big Sky, as a liar trying to save himself. But the ledger was irrefutable. Samuel Moretti's careful handwriting, cross-referenced with death certificates and land transfers, told a story no amount of rhetoric could obscure. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was firm. Guilty on all counts. Solomon Price, who'd sat through the trial with cold confidence, finally showed emotion, not remorse, but rage. "This changes nothing," he shouted as the bailiff cuffed him. "The railroad is coming, you can't stop progress." "Progress isn't the problem," the judge said quietly. "Murder is. 20 years hard labor. May God have mercy on your soul." As they led Solomon away, he looked directly at Grace. The hatred in his eyes was pure and undiluted, and Grace understood that even from prison he would remain dangerous. But she also understood that some battles you fought, not because you could win completely, but because not fighting meant surrendering everything that mattered. Outside the courthouse, Neshoba waited in the shade, unwilling to enter the white man's building even to see justice done. When Grace emerged, she found him whittling a piece of cedar, his hands occupied with the quiet work, while his mind ranged elsewhere. "It's done," she said. He looked up, studied her face. "You don't look relieved." "I am, but I'm also exhausted and scared and not sure what comes next." Grace sat beside him on the courthouse steps. "Solomon was right about one thing: the railroad is still coming. They'll find another agent pushed through another route. This changes one man's fate, but not the larger story." "No," Neshoba agreed. "But stories are made of moments. This moment Solomon pays. That matters. Does it? Your people still don't have the land they were promised. My cabin is still riddled with bullet holes. Big Sky might face charges himself for the bribes he took." Neshoba set down his whittling, turned to face her fully. "After my parents died, I spent 2 years hating everyone with white skin. I was good at hating. It gave me purpose, direction. But it also made me empty. Hate is a fire that consumes everything, including the person who carries it." He gestured toward the courthouse. Today, a white man's court believed a white woman who fought beside an Apache. A white deputy who could have run instead stood and testified against his own interests. A white teacher risks her job every day teaching my people's children. These are small things, perhaps. But small things are what prevent the darkness from becoming total. Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I don't know if I'm that strong to hope after everything." "Hope isn't strength," Neshoba said. "It's stubbornness. It's waking up each day and choosing to try again, even when trying seems pointless." He paused. "You've been doing that for 3 years, Grace. Since Samuel died. You didn't give up then. Don't give up now." Before Grace could respond, Big Sky emerged from the courthouse, his face drawn. "Marshall wants to talk to me," he said. "About the bribes. He's not arresting me yet, but—" He trailed off. "What will you do?" Grace asked. "Tell the truth. Accept the consequences." Big Sky managed a thin smile. "Might be I end up in a cell next to Solomon. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." They stood together on the courthouse steps, 3 people bound by violence and survival, by choices made in desperate moments. They weren't heroes. They were just people who'd chosen when it mattered to stand rather than kneel. That would have to be enough. The journey back to Broken Arrow took 4 days. Grace rode beside Neshoba, their horses moving at an easy walk through late summer heat. Behind them, a wagon driven by Dr. Vogel carried Big Sky, who was still recovering from his shoulder wound, and Dorothea, who'd closed her school for the week to attend the trial. They talked little during the ride, each processing what had happened in their own way. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who'd fought together and survived, who no longer needed words to understand each other. When they finally topped the rise above Grace's cabin, they stopped taking in the damage. Bullet holes pocked every wall. The roof was partially burned. One window was shattered completely. The vegetable garden had been trampled. The chicken coop destroyed, the fence torn down in a dozen places. But it was still standing. "I wasn't sure it would be here," Grace said quietly. "Where else would it be?" Neshoba replied. They rode down the slope. In the yard they found Lucien Barr and several other settlers already at work, men and women who'd been too afraid to help before, but who now, with Solomon in chains, had found their courage. They were rebuilding the fence, clearing debris, patching holes. Lucien approached, hat in hand. "Madame Moretti," he said in his thick French accent, "we hope you do not mind. We thought perhaps you should not come home to only destruction." Grace found she couldn't speak. She simply nodded, blinking back tears. The repairs took 2 weeks. The entire community seemed to materialize. Settlers brought lumber, Apache women showed Dorothea how to weave grass for roof patches, children hauled water from the creek. It became something more than just fixing a cabin. It became a statement: we are here, we will not be moved, we build rather than destroy. Big Sky, his arm in a sling, oversaw the work with the same careful authority he'd once used for Solomon's scheme. The marshal had decided, after reviewing his testimony, that formal charges weren't warranted and the bribes would be noted in his record. But his actions during the final battle had earned him a second chance. He seemed determined not to waste it. Dr. Vogel set up a medical station in the cabin, treating minor injuries from the work and using the opportunity to check on families who normally couldn't afford a doctor's care. He asked no payment, accepting only food and gratitude. Dorothea reopened her school with a new policy announced loudly for all to hear. Any child, regardless of family or background, is welcome. Education is not a privilege, it's a right. And through it all, Grace and Neshoba worked side by side, rebuilding not just a cabin, but something neither could quite name yet. They fell into easy partnership. She would saw boards while he fitted them. He would mix mortar while she laid stones. They developed a rhythm, an understanding that went beyond words. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, Grace found Neshoba standing before the old cabin door, and the one with the crimson handprint still visible despite the smoke damage. He held a can of red paint and a clean cloth. "I thought I should replace it," he said, gesturing to the mark. "It's faded, damaged." Grace came to stand beside him, studying the original handprint, the promise that had saved her life. "What does it mean now?" she asked. "The fighting is over. Solomon is in prison. We don't need protection from bounty hunters." Neshoba was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he said, "Among my people, the red hand is not just protection from enemies. It's a marker of belonging, of kinship. When we mark something with it, we're saying this is part of our circle, part of our responsibility." He dipped his hand in the paint, but before pressing it to the new door, he held it out to Grace. "Together." Grace understood what he was asking, not for romance, not yet, but for partnership. For a public declaration that they stood together, that her land was his land, that her fight was his fight, and vice versa. She placed her hand beside his in the paint, their fingers not quite touching, then together, they pressed their hands to the door. 2 handprints side by side, distinct but overlapping at the edges. When they stepped back, the image was clear and powerful. Not one voice, but 2. Not one person standing alone, but 2 standing together. "It's good," Grace said, and found she was smiling despite the tears on her face. That night, the community gathered for a simple meal in Grace's yard, stew cooked over an open firebread brought by various families, conversation in 3 languages, flowing together like streams meeting. The Apache children played with settler children, running through the dusk, chasing fireflies, while their parents watched and slowly learned to relax in each other's presence. Big Sky approached Grace as she stood watching the scene, his expression thoughtful. "I heard the railroad is sending a new agent next month," he said. "Man named Foster. He's supposed to be honest, or as honest as railroad men get." "Will that be a problem?" Grace asked. "I don't know. But I'll be watching, and this time I'll do it right." He paused. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me, for believing I could choose better." "You did that yourself," Grace said. "I just reminded you who you wanted to be." After Big Sky moved on, Neshoba appeared at Grace's elbow, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the gathering. "I've been thinking," Neshoba said eventually, "about what comes next. For me." Grace felt her heart constrict. "Are you leaving?" "No. The opposite. He turned to face her fully. I'm staying, building a cabin of my own on the land the court granted to my people. It's time to stop drifting, stop living like a man waiting to die. It's time to build something. Where? Grace asked, though she thought she knew. There's good ground upstream about half a mile. Close enough to share the creek. Close enough to... He trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain. Close enough to what? Grace prompted, her heart beginning to hope. Close enough that if you need help, I'm there. And if I need help, you're there. Neshoba met her eyes. We've fought together, bled together, survived together. I'd like to see what we can build together. As neighbors, as friends, as... He stopped searching for words. As partners. Grace finished softly. Yes, partners. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a declaration of love. But standing there in the firelight, with the sounds of community around them, and the future stretching uncertain, but no longer empty ahead. Grace understood that it was something just as important a commitment to try to build, to face whatever came next, side by side. I'd like that, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They stood together as the stars emerged, two people learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Around them, Broken Arrow was slowly healing, slowly becoming something more than just a dusty territorial town waiting for the railroad. It was becoming a place where justice mattered, where different people could stand together, where hope was stubborn enough to survive, even in the hardest ground. The crimson handprints on the door glowed softly in the firelight, a promise made visible. Not a threat to keep people out, but an invitation to stand and speak, to refuse erasure, to build rather than destroy. Some battles Grace had learned you won not by defeating every enemy, but by refusing to become like them. By choosing every day to build something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. It would be hard. The railroad would still come. New conflicts would arise. The prejudices of 1873 wouldn't vanish overnight. But tonight, standing beside Neshoba with the community gathered around them, Grace allowed herself to believe that hard wasn't the same as impossible. That was enough. That was everything. 6 months later, on a crisp February morning in 1874, the Territorial Governor's Office in Tucson issued a formal decree recognizing the Apache water rights along Broken Arrow Creek, making them binding on any company operating within the territory. The decree cited the case of Territory versus Price as precedent, and specifically thanked Deputy now Sheriff Zachary Harlan for his testimony and subsequent advocacy. By then, Grace's cabin had become a community center of sorts, a place where disputes were mediated and plans made. Neshoba's new cabin upstream was nearly complete, built with help from 24 hands. The railroad had indeed come through, but Foster, the new agent, had proven surprisingly willing to negotiate, rather than threaten. Some things had changed. Some hadn't. Big Sky wore his badge with quiet pride, now having earned back the community's trust through consistent, honest service. Der Hank Vogel had taken on an apprentice, a young Apache man, interested in combining traditional healing with modern medicine. Dorothea's school had doubled in size, requiring an expansion. And Grace and Neshoba, their cabins separated by half a mile of creek and cottonwood trees, had indeed become partners in every sense that mattered. They worked each other's land, shared meals, planned together for seasons to come. Romance had come slowly, carefully built on the foundation of mutual respect and survival. On a warm evening in early spring, they sat together on Grace's porch, watching the sun set over land that had almost been stolen, but now was protected. The dual handprints on the door had faded slightly with weather and time, but remained visible, a reminder and a promise. Samuel would have liked you, Grace said, breaking a comfortable silence. Neshoba considered this. I think I would have liked him. Any man you loved must have been worth knowing. It was the first time either had spoken so directly of love, and the word hung in the air between them, acknowledged but not yet fully claimed. I think, Grace said carefully, that it's possible to honor what was and still build what might be. Not forgetting, but not being trapped either. Yes, Neshoba agreed. We honor the dead by living well. In the distance, a train whistle sounded the first regular passenger service through Broken Arrow. The sound that Solomon Price had killed for that, had driven so much violence and pain, was now just part of the landscape, no more significant than birdsong or wind. Progress had come, as it always did. But this time, it had come on terms that honored life, rather than consuming it. Grace reached out, and Neshoba took her hand. They sat together as the last light faded, two people who'd found in each other not salvation, but something better. Honest partnership, hard-earned trust, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow was worth building toward. The red hands on the door weathered, but enduring stood witness to what they'd survived and what they'd chosen to become. And in the gathering darkness, that was enough.